We're looking at graphing the equation of a perpendicular line that goes through a particular point, but we want to see what we're doing. And I love this graphing calculator because it allows you to see visually what's going on. Let's take a basic equation. Let's say y equals 8x. You could think of them as rows of bricks, like 8x plus 2. So there's rows of 8. You have rows of 8 plus 2 extra bricks. And you might think, well, what if I have one row? Well, how many bricks will there be? And you can see visually on the graph. Go up one row means 10 bricks. Okay, so you can use this graph. I love it because you can zoom in, zoom out. What if I have no, that's 60. So I'm following the line for 60, and I have the answer right here. So 480 bricks. So rather than input it, you can put x in and then find y. You can see it visually and point to it. It's a visual representation of what's happening. So we wanted to graph a perpendicular line. A couple things you need to know. You could skip ahead if you want to the main lesson. You won't see a graph, you'll see writing. But we learned y equals mx plus b is the equation of a line when you solve for y and y is alone. It's called slope-intercept form because we learn m is the slope, which gives us how much we rise or fall over, call it change of y over change of x. How much you rise and fall versus how much you go to the right or left. We used to call it rise over run. So looking here, the slope is 8, or 8 over 1 we would say, because we want a bottom number. So we would go up 8, and we would go to the right 1. And that's also what this graph shows us very, very easily. You go up 8, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 over 1. Up 8 over 1. Let me zoom in. I have to clear this though to show you what I mean. So if I take a spot here where 2 is, because it goes through a box or where the two lines meet, and I could go 2, 4, 6, 8, and then I went over 1 because the way the graph is, each box represents from here to here is 2, I mean, from 4 to 6. So in between it would be 5. So right here, let me use a different color. Right here is where 1 would be. So going straight up is 1. We went up 8 over 1. So the slope is 8 over 1. What we learned about perpendicular slopes is you change them. So 8 over 1, that's a terrible color, becomes, we change the sign, so it's negative now, and we flip it upside down, which we call the reciprocal. So before we were doing that, we looked to see if we could figure it out without a lesson. And we graphed it on the software here, and we were able to test some things. So what if we put negative 8x? Here's what our thinking was, and this is important. A graph going up is called increasing. It's a positive slope. A graph going down would be decreasing or a negative slope. So we kind of came to the conclusion, right? To make perpendicular lines, one has to point up or one down, unless it's vertical and horizontal. So we figured one has to be positive, one has to be negative. That's the one thing we learned of two opposite sign. So the next thing we saw though is that it intersected. They crisscrossed, but they were not 90 degrees. They weren't perpendicular. So we needed to do one more thing, and we did the reciprocal, which is to flip the number upside down. So let's take a look in our graph. Instead of negative 8, we need negative 1/8. And now we have 90-degree angles or perpendicular lines. And so it makes sense. If I'm going this way, up 8 over 1, To get this way, I do the opposite. Down 1 over 8, and it'll give me 90 degrees. So let's get to the actual lesson of how to graph or create the equation of a graph for parallel and perpendicular lines. And we were doing some of that here earlier. So if I tell you to write the equation of a perpendicular line that passes through a point, one of the first things we need to do is unpack what they're giving us. So they're passing through a point. Now let me show you on the graph for a moment what that's going to look like, because that's another important part of this. I want y equals, let's say, what was the equation we just did? 2/3 x plus 10 . And that's what we're talking about, this graph here. So we want something perpendicular to that, but passing through the specific point. The specific point is 80/10. So what I'm telling you is not only do I want it perpendicular, but it has to go through that point right there. So we can guess. First thing we're going to do is change the slope to the opposite sign. So it was positive, we're going to change it to negative. And we flip it upside down. So 2/3 becomes 3/2. Right? So we can see now it's perpendicular, but it's not touching the point. So that red line, if we imagine, we'd have to push it up, 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 up. Let me add like 10. Nope, I have to add more. So you can't sit here and guess and check and guess and check. You want exact answers, which algebra allows you to do without even seeing it. You become a little computer. So what we first did was we put in the new slope and it became perpendicular. And here's what I would unpack when I read this. First of all, we're writing an equation, so our final answer needs to be y equals something x plus b. Okay, second is the word perpendicular. So the word perpendicular tells us I need to change my slope. And our slope is our m in front of the x. When y is alone, it's right in front of the x. In this case, it's 2/3. So our new slope is going to be negative 3/2. Opposite sign and the reciprocal, which is to flip the number upside down. So we did that. But right, we were moving the graph up and down or up to see where could we push it to touch the point. That's our y-intercept. In previous videos, we said the y-intercept is where it crosses the y-axis. Right? So when I put 39, that's where it's crossing the y-axis. When I had plus 10 on my first equation, you can see that's where it went through the y-axis, our y-intercept. So this next step, what we do to find the y-intercept, we want that b, and if you have one variable, you can't have two other ones and find the answer. With one equation, you need one variable. So our point given to us is for a reason. That point is to help us get rid of the variables and have the answer for b. So when x is 80, y has to be 10. So when we plug in y is 10 and x is 80, we can now have one variable and find our last step, find the intercept, find b. So what I did was I replaced the y here with 10, I replaced the x here with 80 because that's what our point tells us. Now I'm going to simply calculate or solve this. And this will be negative 120 O plus b. We learned you can do PEMDAS backwards, so check if there's any addition or subtraction. There's a minus 120. to get the variable alone, we do the opposite to both sides because this cancels. So our intercept is 130. So what we ended up finding in this are two things. We first changed the slope and found our new slope is -3/2. Then we plugged in our point to find our intercept, and it was 130. So what we end up doing is putting it into a final equation of a line. The intercept goes here, and the slope goes here. So let me give you a second, and I'll write that down in steps. So the first step is really we decide if it's parallel or perpendicular. With parallel, we leave the slope the same. If it's perpendicular, we change the slope. Step 2, we plug in the xy point to find the intercept. And then we ended up by putting it back into a final equation. So you can pause it if you need to write this down. Again, first step, I looked at the slope and I changed it to -3/2. After I changed it, what I ended up doing was writing a new equation. Let me just be a little bit neater for this review. So I looked at this and changed it to y equals -3/2 x plus b. So what you do in your homework problem is you look at the slope and you write out a y, you write out the x, you write out the b, and you simply put in the new number there. That's your first step, your slope. Your second step will be to plug in your value for x and y, the point. So that y will become 10. The x will become 80. And you'll be left with your y-intercept. And you want to solve for b to get that by itself. So those are the steps. There are other videos that everybody explains and understands things differently. And that's why if you don't ask questions in person, it's hard to give you the explanation you need. If we don't get feedback from you, we don't know what you're lacking or what you understand or don't understand. See, we're explaining things from the point of view of someone who knows it. And it's very hard to remember what it was like when you didn't know it and how to really explain it the right way. So hopefully this helps a bit. Have a good day.